She had spent her entire life in his shadow, trapped in a nightmare no one else could see. To the outside world, she was just another quiet girl, a student with a bright future. But behind closed doors, she lived a life of terror, controlled by the very man who was supposed to love and protect her. For years, she endured in silence, holding on to the hope that one day, she'd be free. Then, one day, she made a decision that could have changed everything. She finally spoke up. She confided in someone, revealing the horrifying truths she had buried for so long. She was ready to escape, ready to break free from the monster who had stolen her childhood. But she never got the chance. By the time anyone realized what had happened, it was too late. The story that would unfold in the days that followed would shock an entire community. It would expose the hidden horrors of a house no one had ever questioned. And it would leave people asking, how did no one see the signs? How did no one stop him before it was too late? This is the tragic case of Keshara Merritt, a story of fear, survival, and the unimaginable cruelty that can exist within the walls of a home. But the most chilling part? She almost made it out alive. Before we uncover the harrowing details of this twisted case, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Because what you're about to hear isn't just a crime, it's reckoning. 17-year-old high school sweetheart, Keshara Merritt, was the kind of girl people noticed but never truly saw. She was quiet, intelligent, and always kept to herself. Her teachers saw potential in her, the kind of brilliance that could take her far in life. But no one ever stopped to wonder why she never spoke about home, why she never invited friends over, why there was always something guarded in her eyes. If they had looked a little closer, maybe they would have seen the truth. Maybe they would have realized that Keshara wasn't just a quiet girl, she was a prisoner. She had never known her mother's love. Her mother, Keshara Merritt, died the day she was born, and from that moment on, her life was defined by loss. But it wasn't just the absence of a mother that shaped her, it was the presence of a father who never wanted her to exist. Alton Merritt should have been her protector, her guardian. Instead, he was the thing she feared most in the world. Alton was a man filled with hate. He hated the world, hated himself, hated being black, and most of all, hated his daughter. He saw his blackness as a curse, something to be ashamed of, and when he looked at Keshara, all he saw was a reflection of everything he despised. He never let her forget that. Every word he spoke to her was laced with cruelty, every look a reminder that she was unwanted. But words were just the beginning. Behind closed doors, his rage knew no limits. He didn't just hurt her, he broke her, piece by piece, year after year. The bruises faded, but the fear never did. He kept her under his control, isolated her from the world. No friends, no outside connections. No one to run to, no one to tell. If she ever thought of escaping, he made sure she understood what would happen if she tried. But Keshara was strong. Stronger than he ever gave her credit for. Despite everything, she excelled in school. She refused to let him take that from her. Education became her only escape, the one place where she could be something more than his prisoner. She poured herself into her studies, dreaming of a future far away from him. But dreams don't always save you. People saw Alton Merritt around town, a quiet, no-nonsense man. He went to work, kept to himself, and didn't cause trouble. No one questioned him. No one saw the monster hiding behind his carefully controlled mask. No one saw the nightmare Keshara was living. And that was exactly how he wanted it. The beatings had started when she was a little girl, but by the time she turned 8, his cruelty had turned into something even darker. The first time it happened, she didn't understand. She just knew it hurt. Knew it made her feel sick and cold in a way she couldn't explain. And when she cried, when she tried to pull away, he told her to stop. That it was normal. That it was what fathers did. At night, he would slip into her room, his footsteps slow and deliberate. She would squeeze her eyes shut, praying that if she stayed still enough, quiet enough, maybe he would go away. But he never did. He would whisper vile things in her ear as he forced himself on her, telling her she belonged to him, and only him. That no one would ever believe her. That no one would care. And for years she believed him. She went to school like any other girl. Sat in class, did her work, walked the halls with her head down, never speaking unless she had to. But inside she was screaming. Every morning, she woke up hoping it had all been a nightmare, that she would open her eyes and find herself in a different life, a better one. But the nightmare never ended. She learned how to survive. How to shrink herself down, to make herself invisible. How to avoid eye contact, how to smile just enough so people wouldn't ask questions. But no matter how well she hid it, the pain never went away. The bruises faded, but the fear never did. As she got older, something inside her started to change. The blind obedience, the silence, she couldn't keep it up forever. The more she grew, the more she started to question everything. Why did she have to live like this? Why did no one see what was happening? And most importantly, how could she escape? She knew the risks. Ulton wasn't just cruel, he was unpredictable. Every time she resisted, even in the smallest way, his rage would come crashing down like a storm. And he could sense it, that shift in her. He knew she was slipping away from him, and he wasn't going to let that happen. The punishments got worse. The beatings came more often, the pain more unbearable. She wasn't just a child to him, she was something he owned, something he refused to lose. And he made sure she understood that. For years, she kept silent. Not because she didn't want to speak, but because she thought no one would listen. But that changed when she met Mrs. Sandifer. Mrs. Sandifer, her English teacher, had been watching her for a while. She wasn't like the other teachers, she paid attention. She saw the way Keshara flinched when people got too close, how she never met anyone's eyes, how she wore long sleeves even when the Texas heat made it unbearable. Most of all, she saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the kind of exhaustion that didn't come from just being tired. It was the exhaustion of someone carrying a weight far too heavy for her shoulders. One afternoon, after class, Mrs. Sandifer gently placed a hand on Keshara's desk. "Stay for a moment," she said softly. Keshara's heart pounded. Had she done something wrong? Had she slipped up somehow? Mrs. Sandifer sat on the edge of the desk, her voice low, careful. "You don't have to tell me anything you're not ready for," she said. "But if you ever need help, I'm here." It was the first time anyone had ever said that to her. For a moment, she couldn't speak. Couldn't breathe. No one had ever noticed before. No one had ever cared. And now, here was this woman, offering her something she had never had before. A way out. That night, she lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of Ulton moving through the house. Her mind raced. Could she do it? Could she finally break free? She didn't have the answers yet. But for the first time in her life, she had something else. Hope. That night, when Ulton attacked her again, something inside Keshara snapped. It wasn't just the pain. She had learned to endure that. It was the finality of it, the way he looked at her, the way he spoke, as if she would never be anything more than his possession. As if she would never escape. She couldn't take it anymore. The next morning, her body ached with fresh bruises, but she forced herself out of bed, forced herself to go to school as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. She could feel it in her bones. She was done being afraid. When the final bell rang, she didn't rush to leave like the other students. Instead, she lingered, heart pounding, hands trembling as she waited for the classroom to empty. Mrs. Sandifer glanced up from her desk, surprised to see Keshara still sitting there. "Sweetheart, is everything okay?" The words unlocked something inside her. She took a deep breath, then another, trying to steady herself. But the moment she opened her mouth, the words came pouring out in a broken, trembling whisper. Every horrific detail. The beatings. The rape, the torture. The nights when Elton crept into her room and stole pieces of her soul. She told Mrs. Sandifer everything. By the time she finished, tears streamed down her face, but for the first time in her life, she felt something close to relief. Someone knew. Someone finally knew. Mrs. Sandifer was horrified, but she kept her composure. She didn't cry, didn't gasp in shock. Instead, she reached across the desk and gently took Keshara's hands on her own. "I believe you," she said. 3 words. 3 simple words. But they changed everything. Mrs. Sandifer promised she would get her help. That she would do everything in her power to keep her safe. And Keshara wanted to believe her. She really did. But deep down, she knew the truth. She couldn't wait for the system to save her. She had seen it happen before, kids pulled from their homes, only to be sent right back. The authorities never acted fast enough, never truly protected the ones who needed it most. If she stayed, if she waited, Elton would find out what she had done. And then, she wouldn't survive. That night, she put her plan into motion. She moved carefully, quietly, making sure not to make a sound as she packed a small bag, some clothes, a little cash she had secretly saved, and a pocket knife, just in case. She wasn't stupid. She knew how dangerous it was. Knew what he was capable of. But she had no choice. She waited until the house was silent. Until she could hear Elton's deep, steady breathing from the other room. The air felt heavy, suffocating, but she pushed past the fear. Step by step, she crept toward the back door, her heart slamming against her ribs. Just a few more feet. Just a few more. A floorboard creaked behind her. She froze. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then, "Keshara!" His voice sent a shiver down her spine. Slowly she turned. Elton stood in the darkness, his massive frame blocking the hallway. He wasn't asleep. He never was. And the look in his eyes told her one thing. He knew. She wasn't escaping. Not tonight. He had sensed the shift in her. Maybe he overheard something, maybe he just knew her too well, but when she stepped into the living room, bag in hand, he was already waiting. "Where the hell do you think you're going?" Keshara froze. Her pulse pounded so hard she could feel it in her ears. Elton stood in the shadows, blocking the doorway, his massive frame unmoving. His eyes flicked to the bag clutched in her trembling hands. His expression darkened, rage simmering just beneath the surface. I was just... She barely got the words out before he lunged. His hand clamped around her throat, slamming her against the wall so hard the breath left her lungs. The bag slipped from her grip, hitting the floor with a soft thud, spilling its contents, her clothes, the cash, the pocket knife she had hidden, her only means of defense. Elton's eyes landed on it. Something in him shifted. "You were gonna leave me?" His voice was low, guttural, almost amused. But there was nothing funny about the way his grip tightened, his fingers pressing into her windpipe. Keshara clawed at his hands, kicked wildly, her body thrashing against the wall. "You think you can just walk out of here?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it, just fury. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her feet barely touched the ground as he lifted her higher, squeezing tighter. The edges of her vision blurred, black dots swimming in her eyes. Then, suddenly, he released her. She crumpled to the floor, gasping, hands clutching her throat as she coughed violently. But there was no time to recover. Before she could move, before she could think, he grabbed her by the arm and yanked her toward the basement door. No. She kicked against him, twisted, tried to break free, but he was too strong. The basement door swung open, the darkness below yawning like a pit waiting to swallow her whole. He shoved her forward. She stumbled down the steps, her knees hitting the rough, cold concrete at the bottom. The air was thick with dampness, with dust, with memories of every horrible thing that had happened to her in this house. Alton stepped down slowly, deliberately, his heavy boots echoing in the small space. He was in no rush. He knew she had nowhere to go. You wanna act grown now? You think you're smart? He reached for something on the tool bench, a wrench. The dim light glinted off the metal as he turned it in his hand. Keshara scrambled backward, pressing herself against the wall. Please. He didn't let her finish. The wrench came down hard. The pain was instant, blinding, as her fingers cracked beneath the blow. She screamed. Shut up. He swung again, striking her ribs this time. She curled in on herself, shaking, choking on sobs she didn't want to let out. He knelt beside her, gripping her face so tightly his nails dug into her skin. His breath was hot, foul, as he whispered. You think anyone out there cares about you? You think someone's coming to save you? He let out a cruel laugh. You're nothing, Keshara. You hear me? Nothing. Her entire body trembled. Pain radiated through her hand, her ribs, her throat. She knew she wouldn't survive that night. She had known the moment she saw him waiting in the shadows. But even as the pain threatened to consume her, she lifted her head. Through swollen eyes, she met his gaze. And she did something she knew would enrage him. She spat in his face. Alton froze. For a split second, there was silence. Then his face twisted with something darker than rage. You ungrateful little. His hands wrapped around her throat again, tighter than before. Keshara's body bucked beneath him, her broken fingers clawing weakly at his grip. The walls blurred, the room spinning as her lungs burned for air. Her legs thrashed against the floor, but her strength was slipping away. Her vision darkened. Her body convulsed once. Then again. And then, nothing. Alton stumbled back, panting, staring at her lifeless body. His hands were still curled in fists, shaking. He hadn't meant to kill her. He just wanted to make her submit. But now she is gone. For 3 days he left her there. The basement was cold, damp, reeking of mildew and death. Keshara's lifeless body lay crumpled where she had fallen, her arms twisted unnaturally, her face frozen in a final expression of defiance. Alton had stood over her for hours that night, pacing back and forth, running a trembling hand over his bald head. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had only meant to scare her, to put her back in her place. She had been getting bold, thinking she could fight back, thinking she could leave. He was supposed to teach her a lesson. But now, she was gone. And he had no idea what to do. At first, he considered burying her. The backyard? No, too obvious. The woods? Maybe. But the thought of dragging her body, digging a grave, covering his tracks, it was too much work. Too much risk. He considered burning the house down, letting the flames erase the evidence, but then where would he go? He had built his life here. He wasn't about to throw it all away over some disobedient little girl. So, he did nothing. For 3 days, he kept the basement door shut, refusing to look at her. He went about his routine as if nothing had changed. He ate. He drank. He slept, fitfully, but he slept. The first night, he swore he heard noises coming from below. The creak of a floorboard. The soft shuffle of movement. His breath itched, but he forced himself to stay in bed, convincing himself it was just the house settling. The second night, the nightmares started. He dreamt of Keshara standing at the foot of his bed, her eyes black, her face bloodied, her lips curled into a smile that didn't belong to her. You think you're safe? She whispered. You think they won't find me? Alton woke in a sweat, his heart pounding. By the 3rd day, the house felt smaller. The air was heavier, suffocating. He snapped at the TV, at the radio, at nothing at all. The silence pressed in on him like a weight. Then, there was a knock at the door. At first, he ignored it, but then it came again. Louder. More insistent. He opened it to find 2 officers standing on his porch, their expressions unreadable. Behind them stood Mrs. Sandifer, her face tight with concern, her arms crossed over her chest. "Mr. Tate," one of the officers said. "We're here for a welfare check on Keshara Tate. She hasn't been to school in 3 days. Elton forced a casual smile, resting a hand on the doorframe as if he had nothing to hide. "Keshara?" He let out a dry chuckle. "That girl ran off again. Always trying to make trouble." Mrs. Sandifer's expression didn't change. "She told me she was planning to leave," she said quietly. "But she wouldn't have just disappeared without telling me. She trusted me." Elton's smile faltered. The officers exchanged glances. "Mind if we come inside, Mr. Tate?" "Now hold on, we can do this the easy way, or we can come back with a warrant," the other officer interrupted. "Up to you." Elton felt the noose tightening around his neck. He had no choice but to step aside. They walked in, their eyes sweeping over the living room, taking in the empty beer bottles, the unwashed dishes. The air was thick with the smell of something rotting. "Where's Keshara's room?" Elton gestured down the hall, hoping they would waste time searching there, but Mrs. Sandifer was already moving toward the basement door. "Wait," he started, but it was too late. The first officer pulled the door open. A wave of decay rushed over them. The second officer gagged, covering his nose. The air was thick, putrid, carrying the unmistakable stench of death. The basement was dimly lit, but they didn't need much light to see. Keshara's body lay in the same crumpled position Elton had left her in. Mrs. Sandifer gasped, her hands flying to her mouth as tears filled her eyes. "Oh my God!" The officers sprang into action. One called it in, speaking in a rushed, urgent tone. The other turned to Elton, his hand already on his gun. "Get on the ground. Now." Elton's body locked up. "Wait, now." He barely had time to react before he was tackled to the floor, his face pressed into the filthy carpet as cuffs were slapped onto his wrists. "She fought back, didn't she?" one of the officers muttered as he tightened the cuffs. "That's why you did it. Because you knew she was finally done with your shit." Elton didn't respond. As they dragged him to his feet, his face twisted, not with guilt, not with remorse, but with fury. He wasn't sorry. He wasn't ashamed. He was just angry he got caught. The trial was a spectacle. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with people who had come to witness the downfall of a monster. Reporters lined the back, their pens scratching against their notepads as they documented every horrifying detail. The air was thick with tension, the weight of Keshara's story pressing down on everyone in the room. The prosecution laid it all bare: 9 years of torture, of rape, of unimaginable cruelty, of a girl who had suffered in silence for far too long. The jury listened as they recounted the broken bones, the burns, the untreated wounds. The teachers spoke of the bruises hidden beneath long sleeves, the missed school days, the whispers of concern that had never been loud enough to save her. Neighbors admitted to hearing the screams, to noticing the way she shrank whenever Elton was near. And then there were the pictures. Images of Keshara's lifeless body, of the basement where she had taken her last breath, of the years of scars mapping out the story of her suffering. Some jurors looked away, some wiped at their eyes, but all of them understood. There was no mercy for Elton Merritt. The defense tried. They argued that he had been overwhelmed, that he had been drinking, that it wasn't premeditated. But there was no excuse for what he had done. No justification for the years of agony he had inflicted on a child who had only ever wanted to escape. The jury didn't need long. Guilty. On all charges: murder, sexual assault, false imprisonment, torture. The judge wasted no time. Alton Merritt, for the brutal and inhumane murder of Keshara Tate, this court sentences you to death. There was no gasp, no outcry. Just silence. Heavy. Final. Alton didn't flinch. Didn't cry. He just smirked as he was led away, as if he still had some control, some power. As if he hadn't already lost. But justice didn't wait for the execution chamber. A year into his sentence, in the dead of night, the guards found him in his cell. His body was mutilated beyond recognition, his death neither quick nor merciful. The details were never officially released, but the whispers spread. They said he had screamed for hours, that whatever happened to him was worse than anything he had ever inflicted. No one came forward. No one claimed responsibility. No one cared. But Keshara's name lived on. She became more than just a victim. She became a symbol. A reminder of the girls who suffer in silence, of the ones who fight even when the world refuses to protect them. Schools held vigils in her name. Activists demanded stronger protections for abused children. People who had once turned a blind eye began to listen. And though she never got the escape she dreamed of, the world never forgot her. Keshara Merritt's story is a chilling reminder of the horrors that can lurk behind closed doors. She fought for her freedom, but the world failed to save her in time. She did everything she could, endured, survived, reached out for help. But it wasn't enough. And that's the part that should haunt us the most. Because how many others are out there, just like her? How many children suffer in silence, afraid that no one will believe them? How many look for a way out, only to realize there is none? The bruises go unnoticed, the screams get ignored, and the monsters walk free, until it's too late. But in Keshara's name, something changed. Conversations began. About the silent suffering of victims, about the predators we overlook, about the responsibility we all have to listen before it's too late. Schools started to pay closer attention. Neighbors who once stayed quiet started to speak up. People who had once turned a blind eye began to listen. Keshara didn't get the escape she dreamed of. But her story became a warning, a call to action, a voice for those who still have time. And if this story shocked you, if it made you think twice about the horrors that exist in the shadows, then don't let it end here. Like and subscribe for more cases that expose the darkest corners of the human soul. Because sometimes, knowing the truth is the only way to stop history from repeating itself.